Okay, so good evening, everybody. Welcome to the East and West Learning Connections. I'm Yang Wang, the president of this nonprofit organization. And tonight is the second session of our 5 policy information session series. Last week, we talked about code of conduct. Tonight, we're going to talk about a conflict of interest, and next week will be anti-discrimination. The facilitator of all these 5 sessions is our Vice President, Ian White. He is also the president of Canadian Council of the Blind, Toronto Visionaries. And before he joined us, I invited him to our organization as guest speaker for a couple of East and West dialogue events. He is just a great leader. I'm so happy to have him on board when we registered our organization. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Ian.
Thanks, Yang. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for that lovely introduction. It's great to be back for another one of these policy sessions, and hopefully this one will be as fun and interesting as the last one. So as Yang mentioned, last time we were talking about the Code of Conduct, which is really a kind of overarching policy that talks about the general behavior, what goes into sort of supporting and affirming the organization and its operational goals and its mission. And today we're going to drill down into one of the policies that feeds into that code, which is the conflict of interest policy. So what I'd like to do is sort of just do a sort of general walk through the policy as it's written, and then we'll sort of take up questions from you guys. I know Yang has a couple of questions that she's already sketched out. The conflict of interest policy can be found on our website at eawlc.org/conflict of interest policy. And each of those words is separated by a hyphen. So if you're interested in really digging into the text of it, it's up on our website. So the general question is, why do we need policies? Why do we put them in place? And I think the answer to that is that policies are sort of part of the administrative structure of the organization. They're meant to act as guidelines and primarily as a statement of values. In addition to the vision and the mission and the bylaws, they really talk about what kind of an organization we want this to be, how we want it to operate, and what are the things, what are the kinds of behavior we will strive for, and what kinds of behavior we will sort of disapprove of and take very seriously. So as a set of values, they're sort of the things we believe in. And what the conflict of interest policy is meant to do is to make sure that we operate in an honest and transparent manner, and that we demonstrate publicly that that is our aspiration, that's our goal. And why do we want to do that? Well, it's because we really want to sort of build trust, both with our internal stakeholders, our members, our volunteers, our board of directors, but also with people outside the organization. For an external observer looking at an organization and deciding whether or not it's a body that you want to become affiliated with or work with, you want to feel good that the way the organization is governed is in line with your general principles or the general principles of the society in which you're operating. And I think it's important for us to be able to demonstrate publicly that we're in line with those kinds of aspirations. So without further ado, I think we'll plow forward. right up at the top of the policy, it talks about who this applies to, and it mentions both volunteers and directors on the board of directors. And I think that it's important to sort of make a distinction here. The principles of the conflict of interest policy are meant most directly to apply to the directors of the organization. So the people who are in a position of power, a position of authority, who are going to be making decisions on behalf of that, that organization, are the ones who really need to take this seriously. Volunteers, I think, in general, don't have as much direct decision-making authority within the organization. But that being said, our volunteers being empowered, to act on behalf of the organization need to be aware that there's a conflict of interest policy and why it's in place. So I think that's the reason why we wanted it to apply to both volunteers and to directors. But it really is meant to be a guide for the directors when they're acting on behalf of the organization. One of the interesting things that I learned as we were sort of going through the process of getting registered and becoming a not-for-profit corporation is that in Canadian law, and I think in most legal systems, a corporation is an entity similar to a person in law, but without the ability to act directly. So an organization can only act through its directors or through its members, through the people who are associated with it. But they are, in fact, acting on behalf of a person who cannot act for itself. I think that's a really interesting idea. And what it does is it puts a great deal of responsibility on the people who are responsible for taking care of that entity, to making sure that it thrives, to making sure that it's healthy and that it grows and can fulfill its mission in life. And so it is part of a director's obligation to take on what's called a duty of care and a duty of loyalty to the corporation. These are principles that are in common practice in Canadian law. And there's an expectation that as a director, you will assume these duties and execute them to the best of your ability. And so the duty of care means just that. It means trying to do your very best to act in the best interest of the organization in whose care sort of you are. That's a really bad sentence, sorry. But the other thing is that there's a concept called the duty of loyalty. And the duty of loyalty basically means that you must be faithful to the entity that is the corporation. And in being loyal to that entity, you must put its interests ahead of your own. You must put its interests ahead of the interests of others. And so when you're making decisions, you want to be making the best decisions you can on behalf of the organization. And that's a really sort of fundamental part of being a director. So I think in the long term, though, what this is really about is it's about providing guiding principles that allow us to act faithfully and honestly and with integrity in order to build trust amongst ourselves and amongst between ourselves and people in the general public and other organizations who are going to work with us and help us thrive as an organization. And all of that really is going to help us in the end to achieve our mission, which is sharing cross-cultural learning. And we can't do that without help from both inside and outside. So that's sort of how it all wraps up. The policy itself is in 4 parts. So there's a rationale, which talks about why we should have a conflict of interest policy. The second part is the purpose, what we hope to achieve by drafting this policy, and how the drafting of that policy will hopefully feed into the rationale for having it in the first place. 3 is the policy itself, what's covered, what's not. And 4 is a series of definitions that are required in order to really understand what is meant by some of the terms in the policy itself. So without further ado, I'm just going to dive right in, if that's okay with you guys. Do you have any questions so far? I mean, are we pretty clear so far as I've gone?
Yep.
Okay. All right. So let's dive in. Part 1, the rationale. So I want to go through this fairly carefully because it's an important statement of why we have this policy in the first place. We want to make sure that the directors are conducting and guiding the affairs of the organization with honesty, integrity, impartiality, and with the interests of the organization and its members always at the forefront of any decision-making process. So that's a pretty succinct way of encapsulating the duty of loyalty. It's making sure that we're operating as well as we possibly can, as honestly and transparently and with the greatest integrity to further the interests of the organization, and making sure that its interests always supersede any other interests when we are making decisions that will affect its health and its thriving. And that, as I mentioned, is part of the duties that directors bear, the duties of care and the duty of loyalty. Part 2, the purpose, is really just outlining in fairly clear and concrete terms a series of ethical standards for behavior concerning conflicts. Because one of the things that's true in all aspects of life is that there are competing interests, right? We're constantly making decisions between competing sets of interests. You know, we have all sorts of pressures in our lives between work and recreation and our personal interests and our personal lives that are always competing for time, resources, energy. So number 2, the purpose, is really, it's an attempt to set out a set of ethical guidelines, really standards to guide behavior around conflict. So what I was saying before I gapped out there was that there are always going to be conflicts. We are constantly sort of being challenged to balance the demands of business and personal life and our personal interests versus commitments we've made to others. So there are always things that we're balancing, always trade-offs we're making, always conflicts that need to be resolved. And I think really what the policy does is it suggests a method or a series of methods that can be used to either resolve those conflicts or to avoid them in the first place. And so I think that what the policy is intending to do is to offer guidance to show sort of what kinds of things might come up as potential conflicts, and to show how by following certain procedures we can sort of avoid being in a state of conflict or making decisions that are unduly influenced by outside interests, as opposed to purely concentrating on the interests of the organization itself. So part 3, the policy itself. There are a number of dimensions to this, so I'll just sort of walk through them. 3.0, prohibited conduct, really just sort of encapsulates why this policy is in place and what is okay and what is not. So the idea is that voting directors, who are the people who are most responsible for making the critical decisions on behalf of the organization and who are responsible for ensuring that it thrives and is well governed, they must refrain from making any decision making any decision or engaging in any discussion or exerting any influence or in any situation which might or might appear to result in a direct or indirect benefit to that director. And so why is it important to concentrate on the idea of a benefit to a director? Again, this ties back to the idea of a duty of loyalty. And it really does ensure that the interests of the organization come first, and that individual decision makers who are meant to be making decisions on behalf of the organization are not in fact making decisions that are unduly influenced by their own interests. So the idea is you never put personal interests ahead of the interests of the organization. 3.1 prohibit directors from benefiting themselves or their family by either accepting gifts, giving preferential treatment, or making personal use of organizations' assets. I think that's fairly straightforward, and those various points will be elaborated in the sections that come immediately after. So for example, 3.2 gifts. The emphasis in this section is really on the difficulty that can arise if someone accepts a gift, and particularly a director, if a director accepts a gift, there's a difficulty there because the perception is that the gift could have an impact, could have an influence on that director's ability to make clear and impartial decisions. There's a difficulty in that accepting a gift can create a kind of reciprocal obligation. So if, for example, I as a director on the board, if I receive a gift from an outside party who has an interest in the board making a decision in a certain direction, if I've accepted that gift, I might feel an obligation to pass that influence on to the others on the board and try to influence the decision in the direction that that outside source would like the decision to go. So the general principle being that nothing that happens should have an influence on a director's decision-making really leads to the conclusion that gifts of just about any kind should be refused or might be accepted on behalf of the organization, but should never be accepted personally. So again, I think that's a pretty important distinction to make. The conflict of interest policy is really interested in the personal benefit that can cause a conflict. Under the second section there, there is an exclusion which says that you can accept a gift if it's of a nominal value, if it's something that is offered as a courtesy. So for example, I have been asked various times to be a guest speaker for various events, organizations. Have I still got you?
Yep.
Okay. And sometimes as a guest speaker, the organization that I'm speaking to will offer me something that is a nominal gift in thanks for my coming out and making the time to speak to their group. It could be something like a gift card from a coffee shop or some small token. Those kinds of things are fine, in part because they're not substantial enough to constitute a reciprocal debt of obligation, and in part because it would be discourteous to refuse. But also, I think because there is no string attached, it's a simple thank you. It's a simple courtesy. It's not a, if I give you this, what'll you give me? It's not one of those arrangements. So again, I think it's a point of sort of good manners to accept those kinds of small honoraria if they're offered. Again, within limits. I think the way we've got this structured, the board of directors has the opportunity to set limits on what the maximum value of those kinds of gifts can be before they need to be reported. And again, we'll talk a little bit about the reporting as we go through.
So Ian, yeah, I did collect the question on this. Do you want me to ask you later, or right now people can just jump in and ask you questions? Which way would you prefer?
I'm fine either way. Do you want to ask the question now?
Yeah, okay. Usually how much would be that nominal gift item? I remember before, when guest speakers came, that's in person, I prepare like a $5 gift card from Tim Hortons. That must be nominal. But how much usually how much would?
That's a really good question. I don't have a firm fixed answer to that. I think that's something that the board will need to discuss to decide on what constitutes an upper limit before the gift would need to be reported. And I think, you know, in my experience, just from having done this a few times, like I've had gift cards offered to me for doing a guest speaker spot of $25, you know. I know some people will offer honoraria to a lecturer or something like that of $100 or something like that. It's really going to vary depending on the situation, but I think at the end of the day, it's up to the board to decide as the sort of ethical leaders of the organization where their comfort line lies, to decide when a gift has exceeded the value at which it really needs to be reported to the board. I mean,
it would be nice though, because we are quite a new organization, so it'll be good if we can know some usual practice from other organizations, or if people have any experience here, please share.
Yeah, I was actually just going to throw this question out to the folks on the line here today. Do you guys have any sense of what that kind of courtesy gift might look like? I don't know, Eleanor, do you have any experience with this sort of thing?
I think the other than a financial honorarium, which would probably be, excuse me, in the range of $100. But I've also been given a $50 bottle of wine, which of course you can just get rid of the evidence. But yeah, and otherwise it's I think the gift cards that I've received have been quite small. It
Mhm.
also depends on, and I'm not really sure how this weighs in, but if it's a really significant thing for the giver,
Mhm.
then it has a different influence. So
Exactly.
for somebody to present a $20 gift card, that's a pretty clean situation.
Mhm.
But once you get past $100, you know, I think even, you know,
Yeah, that's sort of what I was pointing to, was this idea that there's a threshold, right, past which things get uncomfortable.
yes.
And as soon as you hit that threshold, there is almost an obligation to report to the board that the offer of a gift has been made. And I think it's up to the board to sort of set policy on when a gift like that should be declined, or if it can be accepted on behalf of the organization as opposed to on behalf of the individual, right? And it really depends on the circumstances and what strings are attached, because this whole issue of conflict of interest is really around influence. It's around, do people outside of the board have direct influence on the decision-making process at the board?
Mm-hmm. And how about like treatment, like treats, like a meal?
Mm-hmm.
If people, you know, invite you, treat you with a meal,
mm-hmm.
or help you with, you know, with some in daily life. So how, what do you say in that area?
Yeah, again, these are sort of messy conditions that I think the board needs to have some time to sort of work out what its position is going to be.
What's the usual practice here, like in the context of Canadian culture?
I'm going to freely admit that I don't know.
Nobody treats you with a meal. That's too bad.
It's not that. It's that I have been treated with meals, but only in a business to business context.
Yeah.
Where there is a kind of reciprocal relationship building that is going on there. And it is absolutely with the intent of creating an influence, right? And everyone acknowledges that in business. And so there's a certain amount of acceptance that this is how business is done. When you get into the nonprofit sector and you're dealing with an organization that is strictly focused on connecting various cultures and providing opportunities for different cultural groups to learn from each other, I don't have a frame of reference for that, because this is the first time I've ever actually been a director in this role. So I could tell you what my personal opinion is as a director, but I don't know what the other directors on the board are going to say. So I don't want to cloud the issue by sort of talking about my personal opinion when it's not actually a directive from the entire board.
Mm-hmm. So, so Wei, you talked about this FDA staff. They cannot even buy stock.
Right. They cannot themselves cannot buy any pharmaceutical company related stocks. Their direct relatives, like their kids, daughters, sons, cannot buy pharmaceutical company stocks either.
Let's dig into that. Why can't they?
The primary reason, because they may get information like a drug approved or disapproved before anybody else. So
that will affect the stock price.
Yes, that will directly influence the stock price.
So there's a situation where someone with inside information could benefit financially by owning stock in a company that they know the stock is going to rise before everybody else does.
Also known as insider trading.
Exactly.
Right.
And that is unethical, flat out. right? So again, it's about making sure it's also a situation where a person who owns stock in a pharmaceutical company and is simultaneously trying to make fair and unbiased decisions on behalf of the FDA, the drug regulator, right? They may say to themselves, well, if I push my colleagues to approve this drug,
right,
the stock price of the stock that I own in this pharma company that is developing this drug will go up and I will benefit directly. So I have an interest, a personal interest in making more money by having that stock go up. So I will influence my colleagues and maybe approve a drug that isn't quite ready for approval or hasn't quite passed all of the, the testing that it needs to go through or whatever the process is. So there's a clear example of someone in a conflict of interest policy because their interests are superseding their ability to make impartial judgments on behalf of the organization they're working for, right?
Yeah, and I'm wondering whether I am thinking maybe they just cannot go to some like dinner or something to be treated by like people from pharmaceutical companies. This is my guess. What do you think, Wei?
They're strictly forbidden to get any reimbursement, go to give any talk, visit any pharmaceutical company.
Mm-hmm.
They have to, whatever they do, anything, activities like that outside the FDA organization, they need to apply for permission beforehand. Okay, like they want to give a talk in China, and the Chinese conference wants to reimburse the travel expense, then you need to apply for permission.
Mm-hmm.
And in most of the case, it won't be approved.
Right. And that's because the FDA will have an actual ethics board who will evaluate each submission and will decide on whether it is contradicting the ethical standards of the FDA. Yeah. And compromising its integrity, right?
Ian, can you imagine a situation for this group that might occur?
So this actually leads us really neatly into the next section, which is disclosing confidential information. So what kind of information are we talking about? So basically it's anything that gives an outside entity any kind of an advantage or a benefit, especially at the expense of making the best decisions on behalf of the organization. And insider trading is a perfect example of that. But the idea here is that, let's say, for example, 20 years from now, when we are a massive organization and we have $1 million in assets, and we decide we're going to buy a plot of land and we're going to hold an architectural competition to build a building. So it just so happens that I, as a director on the board at the time, have a friend who works in an architectural firm that does this kind of work. And I make a recommendation to the board that this company should be on the short list as a competitor, right? And then I watch the board go through the process of setting the parameters for the competition. What are the critical things that have to be included in a proposal in order for the competitor to win the bid? And what is going to be the weighting of those items, right? And then it just so happens that while the bid is open and my friend's company is in the process of putting their proposal together, that he and I are in my backyard, having a barbecue, and he says, geez, this competition is going to be great for our firm. We're really looking forward to putting in a great submission. Is there anything that we should concentrate on in particular? Like, are there things that we should really focus on in order to make sure that our bid is as solid as possible? And I, as director, say, well, it just so happens that I know there are 12 criteria, but really it's the last 3 that are going to be most heavily weighted in the judging. Well, right there, I've given him a competitive advantage against the other people bidding, right? That the other bidders don't have, that might put him in a better position to win that bid, even if his bid is perhaps not the lowest bid, or even if there are other aspects of the bid that he is not as solid on. So his bid might come in looking like it's the best proposal on the table, but that's only because he had information that the other bidders didn't, right? So I've put my friend and his interests ahead of the best decision that could be made on a level playing field with the other bidders. And that's absolutely not good. Because what I'm doing is I'm subverting the fairness of the process by doing that, right? If all three bidders had all the same information, that would level the playing field. But if I leak information to one bidder because he happens to be my friend, then I'm putting his interests ahead of those of the organization, because then the competition is not being judged apples to apples, as we say. It's not being judged fairly across the board.
If I could invent a scenario.
Sure, go ahead.
Let's say somebody invites you to have coffee and wants to see if East and West could work with their organization, their nonprofit organization. Mm-hmm. Where's the line there? Should that then be turned over to the board of directors, or can you have a conversation about that, or could I have a conversation about that? Could any of us?
I think that we could, yeah. In the sense that if we are working towards satisfying the requirements of our mission, if we are working within the articles of our incorporated charter, then we are doing the right things to move the organization forward and keep it healthy, right?
I'm thinking of the disclosure business.
Mm-hmm.
As much as anything.
I think where it gets into difficulty is really when it comes back to the board being able to make a fair decision. If there is undue influence in that decision, or if there is a disclosure that has skewed the data that is being used to make a judgment, I think that's where we get into difficulty.
Okay.
I think it would be good if in that case this director can debrief to other at the board meeting about his or her meeting with this organization, and just debrief what they talked. So it will keep all the board informed.
Another example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all the board informed, and also it's a disclosure. It's not like behind the door; it's open in front of the board.
Yeah, one of the things that that the privacy policy talks about, and it is actually mentioned a little further down here, I think, is that information can be disclosed if the board approves it, or if it's required by law. So if the board is basically saying to you as director, go to this meeting, represent us, you may disclose the following points, boom, 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 right? Then you're completely within the limits. That's fine. Where it gets really tricky is if, for example, we as an organization have a board meeting and we decide on a future project that would be of great benefit to the organization, right? And I, as a director, go out and I meet with somebody who is a representative of another organization similar to ours. And I say, hey, we've come up with this great idea. We're going to do this. And that person then goes back to their board and says, hey, there's this great idea that East and West is working on. You know, we should do that too. And if they get it out of the gate first, then we're in a position where we're not going to reap the benefit of that great idea that we have that is sort of proprietary to us because they've sort of scooped us in the market, right? And I can't think of a specific example of how that would actually work mechanically, but that's the kind of idea. It's disclosing information that is sensitive to the health of the organization and its future thriving, or making decisions that really skew the decision-making process. I think those are the two main criteria I can think of at the moment. Mm-hmm. So how about we continue walking through the policy and see if any of that clarifies?
Sure.
It's 10 to 9 now.
Yeah.
I just thought I'd.
Yeah, thank you. So 3.4 talks about giving preferential treatment, and what that basically precludes is the idea that if you have a friend or a family member who's going to directly benefit from a decision made at the board, you're not really serving the best interests of the organization, because that person who works, who is your family member who works for that company, their company may or may not be actually the best choice. They might not be the most competitive or the most timely or the most trustworthy or whatever. And really what you're doing is you're putting your family interests ahead of the interests of the organization. The example I can think of is, like, for example, if you have a family member who works for a printing company and we decide that we're going to set up a deal with a printing company to print all of our brochures and our posters and our flyers and things like that. You as director, you could bring to the board the information that, here's a printing company that we should consider. But you should also disclose that you have a family member who works for that printing company. And so you should also make it clear that you won't participate in any of the decision-making around how to award the contract to the printing company, because you have a conflict of interest there.
It's a little bit of an aside, Young, but we might want to talk to Ian about the disclaimer.
Mm-hmm.
Not right now, but.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, let's see how far we can get through this, and then if we have time, we'll get into that. Okay.
Okay.
So the thing is, you disclose it, but you can participate in the discussion. You can bring up the information, bring the information to the table and discuss, but you just do not participate in the decision-making process.
Right. Yeah. You basically, as soon as you've disclosed that there's a potential conflict of interest there, you're obligated to, let's call it, recuse yourself, which means to remove yourself from the discussion and the decision.
Oh, so you do not participate in the discussion as well? No,
because part of the discussion is about the potential for influence, right? Mm-hmm. If you're discussing which printer to go with, you might be able to really sort of promote the the virtues of your brother's company, and you might sway people by doing that, right? So again, you're putting your brother's interests, your family interests, before the rational process of the board. So 3.5, participating in decision making, this is exactly what we're talking about. So it's basically, yeah, as we're saying, you just need to disclose the conflict and then don't participate in the discussion or the decision making, because otherwise you're just working at cross purposes, right? The last couple of pieces of that section talk about if you have involvement with another organization and you're involved in their decision-making processes, and if they're trying to decide on a course of action that might adversely affect our organization, then again, you're in a conflict of interest position, because you can't help to further the interests of their organization without undermining your duty with respect to our organization. So you have to sort of back out of that process as well. 3.6 compliance is pretty straightforward. It's basically just asking that everybody sign off on the policy. And we'll talk about that and the signing of a declaration in a minute. 3.7 penalties. It's just a statement that conflict of interest is a pretty serious matter, and that it'll be taken pretty seriously by the board, because it essentially undermines the credibility of the organization. It breaks trust with, if it happens, it breaks trust with, you know, the members and people outside the organization. And if that trust is shaken, it can really adversely affect our ability to carry out our mandate. And finally, 4.0 is just a series of definitions. I think those are fairly straightforward as well. So in the interest of time, let's dive back into some questions. Eleanor, you had a question about the declaration.
About a disclaimer.
The disclaimer, yeah, sorry.
Sometimes people, and sometimes it's people like me, come and speak, or maybe even you, Ian, would speak to the membership or other members of the public who come to an East and West event. And especially if they're, so we've been talking about East and West needing a disclaimer, you know, basically, you know, these are not the views of the management sort of thing.
Okay, yeah.
And if it's a blanket disclaimer so that it can be used whenever East and West needs a disclaimer, that would be the ideal thing.
Eleanor, we can work on that later. So
okay.
We'll work out a disclaimer, and we can bring this to the board.
Yeah. I was trying to fit that back into the discussion of the conflict of interest policy, and I was sort of scratching my head there. So
because that's exactly what it is. It's saying we're not responsible. East and West is not responsible if this turns out to be a conflict of interest.
I see what you're saying. Okay.
Yeah.
But we can figure it out that later.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. That's fine.
Okay. Well, thank you. And we do have some questions.
Great. Okay.
Like I remember there's an article saying directors cannot make use of the organization's resources. So how about the social network resource? So we have members. So directors have access to the contact information. So I think we need to really make it clear.
Okay, so again, the distinction is not merely use of organization assets. It's use of organization assets for personal gain. okay?
Mm-hmm.
If you're acting on behalf of the organization and you're doing that in good faith, then you're leveraging the organization's assets to further the organization's goals, right? If you're using those assets for your own personal benefit, then you're in a conflict position.
Yeah, so this is the, there's a fine line here, because I volunteered for other organizations, and they happened. So this person, he ran his own business, and he sent emails to, to the clients of the organization I worked for.
Okay.
So I think that's quite a conflict of interest. Yeah. But on the other hand, say we're all volunteers, and people come together, they get to know each other. So that's one way they develop their social network. So what is the fine line here, especially as a director?
So this is a little bit difficult for me because I'm not a social media user, to be honest. But having said that, I think that the intent of that clause is really to talk about, let me give you a concrete example, and it's one that's really clear. So if I work in an office and I go to the stationery cabinet and I take a whole packet of pens and I put it in my briefcase and I go home with it, and I take those pens and use them at home, and I'm not using them for anything to do with the business. I just need some pens, and they're sitting in the closet and they're free, so I take them, right? That is technically theft. That's a conflict of interest because I'm not using company assets to perform company business. I'm not using those assets for the benefit of the company. I'm using those assets for my own personal benefit, right? And I think that's really the guiding principle behind a lot of this stuff. It is that as long as you are acting in good faith on behalf of the organization, you're within the bounds. And as soon as you start using the things you have access to for your own personal gain, that has nothing to do with the benefit of the organization, then you're outside the bounds and you're in a conflict position. How does that apply to social media? I think if I were to come into East and West Learning Connections as a member, were to join the social media feed, and then were to use that feed to broadcast advertising about my business to everybody in the organization, then that would be a bad thing, because I'm not really interested in supporting or furthering the interests of the club. I'm simply looking for customers, right? And I think that kind of behavior should be blocked. Because that's if every one of our members did that, you'd have a mailbox full of advertising, and that's not why people come to the organization. They come to the organization because they believe in its mission. They come to it as volunteers because they want to further its goals. They didn't come to it to be bombarded by a wide range of advertising from sources that do nothing to benefit the cause that they're actually interested in supporting, right?
So it would be from the point of view of protecting members' privacy.
I think that's much more of a privacy issue than it is a conflict of interest. If it were a board member doing that, then it would be a conflict, right? Because they would be leveraging, they would be leveraging private information that has been vouchsafed by the members to us to keep private.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. So if as a director I did that, if I used the membership list and its contact information to broadcast advertising for my business that is nothing to do with the organization, then yes, I would absolutely be in a conflict position.
But
that would be a situation where the board would be required to take action. Right?
Does the membership have full access to the, in effect, mailing list of the entire membership?
No.
Okay, so that's good.
Yeah, so all this, we kept it in confidentiality. So,
okay,
yeah, unless say some member, they approach us, say, can I, get to know this person, this volunteer, then I go to that volunteer, ask, there's a person who wants to. So if they both agree, then I help them get connected.
They basically, what it amounts to is the information is absolutely private until such time as the member themselves gives consent for their information to be shared.
Yeah. I also have a question here. So in social gatherings, so you introduce people, right, to each other. As a director, we may know more members and know more about them. So when you introduce people, what fine line you should keep in mind, like what to say, what not to say. Say, like, you know where they work, all this kind of information.
But that information has been shared with you as a director in privacy, right? So making an introduction is simply introducing someone by name, right? Any other information should theoretically be volunteered by the individual themselves.
Right.
It's not up to us to share that information because it's really easy to cross the line and say, give away information that could open up someone to harassment or, abuse.
Yeah, great. So name, just the name.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
And sorry, I'm going into my conversational brain, but
that's okay.
That you would say, oh, hello, Ian, this is Wei, and or I'd like to introduce you to Wei. And Wei, Ian and I were just talking about whatever it was you were talking, nuclear physics, something like that. Yep. So there's no need for the conversation to stop.
You're
just bringing in someone else without spilling the beans.
Yeah, because as friends, usually say, this is Ian, this is Eleanor, like she is a professional a coach, right? Personal communications coach. So you would tend to say that. And then, okay, Eleanor, this is Ian, like he's the president of, CCCB.
And that's fine. That's fine. Those are professional credentials that don't disclose anything that isn't already public. Okay. So,
but some people would feel
talking in general terms about someone's interests is probably fine. If I happen to have a particular passion for, let's make something up, sailing, and you happen to know that Wei is an avid sailor, you might put us together and say, oh, you guys both like sailing, so you guys should have lots to talk about. So I don't think there's anything wrong with that sort of information being shared. It's when you get down to, you live in this part of the city, or this is your phone number, or,
Or that is both being in prison.
That is obvious, like a phone number or your age or, address, that's definitely no. But sometimes like where like this person works or something like that is.
But again, you can talk about somebody working for a pharmaceutical company without mentioning the pharmaceutical company.
Yeah,
or,
yeah.
you know, you could say they work for the government without talking about what aspect of the government they work in. Now that might, you know, promote a follow-up question that would put somebody on the spot, but then it's their choice to answer that question or not.
Right.
That's a good point. Yeah, good point.
I mean, to a certain extent, we're all adults. And, you know, we have a certain amount of responsibility for what we disclose and what we don't in social settings. But I think, you know, when we're wearing our hats as directors of the organization, we have to be a little bit careful that we don't tread over that line and start divulging personal information that could disclose, you know, something private about someone.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
You know, in a lot of cases, it's information that has been offered to us in confidence because it's necessary for us to be able to perform our function as an organization. We have to know, we have to have people's mailing addresses because that's part of the soon to be published bylaws, you know, that we need to be able to contact people in writing. That's a functional requirement of how we operate. And so we take that responsibility for gathering that data and keeping it safe, right? Same with phone numbers, same with email addresses. If people, you know, join a Facebook group and they have no security settings on their Facebook profile, that's not really our responsibility. Like we don't, we don't police that. That's up to the individual and their ability to, you know, manage their own security online. So there are things that we have jurisdiction over, and I think there are things that we don't. But at all times, I think we need to be just aware that certain kinds of information are sensitive and need to be held in trust, right? Does that sort of answer the question, I hope? Yeah.
We really need to be very careful about the information disclosed. Yes.
Yeah, and we'll actually be talking about the privacy policy in a couple of weeks. So come back for that one, Eleanor.
Yeah, I will.
Yeah.
So no, it's good. These are all great because they're really helping us sort of, you know, get to grips with the specifics of this stuff. And it's one thing to talk in general terms about a policy and how it offers guidance, but it's another thing to evaluate cases and say, well, what happens if we do this? Does that constitute a breach? You know,
I wonder. Really I wonder what our participants here. What questions do you have, or any stories you would like to share?
Yeah, have you guys ever found yourselves in a situation where you felt you had to make a decision between competing interests?
I can say some examples in my academic career.
Okay.
Like as a statistician, I collaborate with many other researchers. So suppose, for example, I worked with a professor who studied the efficacy of a drug. Then the results turn out to be negative. So the professor doesn't want us to publish the results because it's negative, and she is or he is applying for a new grant to evaluating more further for that drug. Right. So if we publish the negative results beforehand, she or he will not likely to get the new grants for that. So it happens. So we argued, we talked, we disclosed, and unfortunately, I did not turn out to be a good result. So we stopped collaboration, and we're still friends, but just say hi in the occasion. So
yeah, that is absolutely a clear case in which you have information that as a trusted authority, you have an obligation to disclose. By disclosing it, you will undermine the further professional aspirations of your friend who's working on this project, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, she's not going to like that. She's not going to be very happy. But, you know, the difficulty there is, what could you have done differently, in the sense, like, do you hang on to that information and just don't disclose it? And then she gets a grant and spends more money and more time working on it that isn't going to be effective?
It's very tough to me. Actually, I try to talk to the high level administration. Mm-hmm. And the chair, the dean, they don't want to make it a big, they want to make it as little as possible. Mm-hmm. So they talk to more like persuade me to mm-hmm. to go outside or go public, because mm-hmm. it's a small project, and the professor is the initiator of the project. Mm-hmm. So she has fully control of the data, mm-hmm. and she has the power to decide whether to publish or not, or mm-hmm. delay the publication. Let me put it this way.
Yeah.
So because we terminate the collaboration since then, I did not talk to her or him anymore. So mm-hmm. I don't know the new grant, the status of the new grant. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm still struggling nowadays how to do that, because we have, well, I'm not doing this kind of thing anymore now, and I will state really clearly beforehand, not waiting until I have a negative result. Mm-hmm. So when we start the first talk with the project leader, mm-hmm. I'll make it clear. I said we need to draft a research proposal, no matter what is funded or not funded. Mm-hmm. We will propose a research question, and we will propose the analysis plan. My responsibility will finish and complete the analysis, and we will make decisions not based on the results, but based on the merit of the research, not based on whether it's negative or positive.
I see, okay.
Now that's easier.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
I haven't experienced any more like that here, mm-hmm. but I do experience a little bit different things, because now I have the record of everything we talk, everything we emailed, because mm-hmm. some researcher said, oh, I'm going to pay you for your consulting with statistics. But later on, he said, oh, I don't have enough money. So all I need to do is I learned a hard lesson. So I pull out the email.
Yeah.
Then just email, copy him, copy my chair. Mm-hmm. Then the next day he will send us the bill invoice.
So you made a good disclaimer beforehand.
Yeah.
Then that makes things easier.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, the back to the disclaimer, it should always be known in advance, and that's a great approach that you took. Just put your cards on the table.
Mm-hmm. That was 10 years ago. I actually not very good about the conflict of interest at all. I took the training every 4 years. But sometimes mm-hmm. you just quickly skip the contents and jump to the quiz. There were always a small quiz after that. And I said, oh, I finished the quiz. I passed it. That's all.
Yeah. No, it's, I think, to pick up on Eleanor's point, I think part of the reason that we wanted to get these policies put together and put them up publicly on our website was exactly to do that, was to lay our cards on the table and say to people, this is how we want to operate. This is how our organization will expect to do business. And we want everybody to know it, right? We want everybody who comes to us, whether you're an individual or an organization, we want you to know that this is how we operate. These are the kinds of things that we will engage in. These are the kinds of things we will not. And really making it clear right from the get-go that, you know, we have certain standards that we're going to try really hard to abide by. And that's an obligation we take on as directors, you know. really try to make clear to everybody and communicate clearly and concisely that this is how we want to be. This is the kind of organization we want this to be. Do you guys have any other questions or examples, or shall we wrap this one up and come back to it next week with anti-discrimination?
Okay, yeah, does anyone have anything to share or ask? Okay, so Eleanor and Wei, you don't have anything else?
No.
You guys are full of stories. Okay, because it's okay now. It's like bedtime story. Okay.
What is the time frame for this kind of discussion? Do we have 2 hours, 3 hours?
It's supposed to be 1 hour, but I found 1 hour is not enough. So maybe next time we should put it as 1 hour and a half.
Yeah, I'm thinking maybe because we don't
always
run
over.
1 hour
and a half.
Yeah.
It's basically until people run out of questions.
Right, because Ian need to do this presentation to go through the key points, but then people need time to really, contribute the questions, discussions, the stories. So I think 1 hour and a half would be more appropriate. Yeah.
Probably, yeah. Yeah, and I mean, if you guys have further questions, if you sort of want to read through the policy and something else occurs to you, feel free to get in touch. You can email us at info@eawlc.org and just post a question, or if you're on the social media feeds or whatever, feel free to get in touch. We'll be happy to continue the conversation, because that's what we're here for.
Great.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Ian. That was great.
Good. Well, I hope it was fairly comprehensive.
Yes.
As I said, we're trying to put our cards on the table here. So next week we'll be looking at an anti-discrimination policy, and that should be interesting. It's a whole sort of travel down the rabbit hole of the Human Rights Code in Ontario. And that's an area that I'm really not familiar with at all. So I've got some work to do between now and next week.
You've got a week.
Yeah. Yeah. We look forward to that. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Okay.
And thank you, everyone, for participating
thanks
and
a lot,
sharing.
guys.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Thank you.